welcome everybody. I'm Vince Bach. I'm a member of the Board of Directors for Minnesota Pork. It's been a really good Pork Congress. I do want to give a hats off to our wonderful staff at the office, under the auspices of Joe Ressler's leadership, so I think we should give them a hand. So it's nice to see, some friendly faces out there. We know our industry's been facing some challenges. I'd like to think that we will never see another year like last year, but Rick, you and I are both the same age that we know good times coming, good times go. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker this morning. John Greteman is Vice President of Hogs and Commodity and Ingredient Hedging at CIH. John is going to grace us with his wisdom and maybe a little wit here and there. But today we have an opportunity to learn from John about the key drivers that will influence producer profitability next year and beyond, and the hedging strategies to employ based on current market dynamics. It's my pleasure to introduce John Greteman. Good morning, John.
Everybody for joining us. On the way over here this morning, I was kind of marveling at how different the weather situation is this year versus the second day of Pork Congress last year. I think you guys got maybe 8 or 10 inches of snow or something like that, and it was canceled. So quite the change out there today. And really the whole winter, right? I mean, you guys have got maybe 1 or 2 snowstorms, and that's about it. So knock on wood, hopefully spring's just kind of around the corner here. So. Like Vince mentioned, I'm John Greteman with CIH. Just a 1-minute introduction of myself for those of you that don't know me. I live in Waukee, Iowa with my wife and twin daughters who have a big birthday coming up. They're either turning 8 or 2, depending on your perspective, here in a couple of weeks. I started with CIH about 16 years ago, and I work out of and help run our Des Moines branch office. And then help lead the swine team with a colleague of mine, Tim Hughes. I think probably most of you guys know him in general. But we lead a team of about 15 of the, I think, smartest and most dedicated account executives that, are fortunate enough to work with a lot of you guys on a week-to-week basis. So, appreciate everybody coming and appreciate Minnesota Pork, getting us together here today. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to review. So first off, just a quick overview of the hog fundamentals. We'll start with some supply fundamentals and then kind of hop into sow slaughter and weaned pigs. I think the question that everybody's kind of asking themselves is the industry contracting? And what does that mean for us from a price and supply perspective going forward? Then we'll touch a little bit on exports, primarily kind of monthly exports, just because they're a little bit more holistic, but also weekly exports over the last couple of weeks. Run over cash cutout, futures prices. Really briefly touch on some feed fundamentals. There's not a ton going on there this time of year, at least domestically here anyways. And then give you guys some strategies to potentially think about if you felt it made sense for your operation in general. So to start off with hog slaughter, I mean, if you look at the left hand, and let me take a step back and just explain the graph. So most of the graphs are going to look like this throughout the presentation. I always forget to run over it. So what you're looking at is a ranges graph. So it's, in this case, it's hog slaughter. It's the 5-year range. So in the middle there, you've got a dotted line. That's the average hog slaughter for any given period over the past 5 years. And then above that, you've got a green shaded area up to the high end of hog slaughter for any given week over the past 5 years. And then you've got the minimum down below that. For most of these graphs, the red line will be last year. And then the blue line over on the left-hand side is what we've got, so far under our belts for this year in general. So again, a ranges graph. You can see the second data point there. That was the 1 week that we've had winter this year so far in general. So the second week of the year, I think hog slaughter was down about 500,000 head or so versus the same week the year prior. But the subsequent data points or the subsequent weekly hog slaughters are pretty elevated. So you can see last week, at least the initial estimate is about 2.62 million head there, which was up, 5 to 6% versus the same period last year. And if you look at the last several weeks of slaughter there, really elevated week over week. You can kind of see down below here. That's the 1 year change for the last several weeks of slaughter. So up significantly to the point where we're only down like 0.2% on year-to-date slaughter. So, pretty similar to last year so far as production goes. This is, same range as graph, but this is total producer sold carcass weights. And, just the point here is it depends on which data point you look at. I like to watch kind of a 5-day rolling average on the weight side of the equation, but we're a little bit heavier than we were at this point in time last year, so that's adding a little bit more pork to the market relative to the same number of animals there last year. Depending on the day, we're maybe a pound and a half above where we were at this point in time last year. Not the case on the packer side of the equation, and the blue line is probably a little skewed by the last data point there. So again, it depends on what specific data you monitor, but generally we're down 3, 4, even 5% versus the same day last year on the packer sold or packer owned animals in general. Now some of that is at the beginning or the first half of last year. Producer weights dropped really significantly versus prior years, and packer weights stayed relatively heavy. So I think, some of that year-over-year comparison is due to heavier weights last year, but, at least this is helping a little bit from the overall supply or availability of pork out there. And then this is sort of the combination of the two, so not much different, because the packer and producer weights are largely offsetting each other, so not much different than the hog slaughter. Just massive kills and pork production over the past couple of weeks here. Last week we were up 6 to 7%, and the prior couple of weeks up 4 to 5% versus the same weeks last year. So now year to date, we're actually only down about 0.1% on the pork production side of the equation. So we're not that far into the year yet, but so far it feels a little bit like deja vu on the supply side of the equation, unfortunately. So is that going to change going forward? I mean, I think we all think so and probably hope so, right? So this is old data at this point. This is the December Hogs and Pigs report. We've got another measuring point coming up here in a couple of weeks, and then we'll see that data at the end of March. And, I think everybody's hoping that we see the kept for breeding number continue to come down. So on this report, I think the 2 points that everybody was focused on is that kept for breeding there, down about 3.3%. So we did contract the breeding herd. But then, unfortunately, you had the pigs per litter. Well, fortunately, but unfortunately, you had the pigs per litter, up significantly year over year. Certainly helps everybody from an efficiency perspective, but offset a lot of that, contraction in the breeding herd. And, just a couple of points on the breeding herd side of the equation. There's a lot of chatter recently about how the industry is just not contracting and hasn't contracted and stuff like that in general, or at least the sow contraction that we're seeing is being offset by efficiency gains. Just to point out from the peak back there in like 2019, 2020 timeframe, we're actually down about 8.5% on the kept for breeding number. So we have contracted pretty significantly over a few year time horizon. I think just not as much as what some were hoping over the prior year time horizon. Then, one point, so this graph here is pigs per litter over the past 10 years. And you guys can see, just kind of generally March is higher. That jump year over year was certainly abnormal in magnitude. But, if you think back, I think at least part of that was, right here, where we didn't increase pigs per litter over the past couple of years as rapidly as what we had been prior to that. So if you look at trend line, we add about 0.13 pigs per litter on the December Hogs and Pigs report year over year. And yeah, it was a big jump, but again, part of that is just because we were so low the prior couple of years. A lot of that, I think, is because of the PRRS issues that, you guys had here in Minnesota, we had down there in Iowa. It was just kind of, a pretty tough go of it over the past couple of years as far as pigs per litter and efficiency goes. So going forward, hopefully we've got that really nasty PRRS strain kind of behind us there. Although in the past couple of weeks, I've heard some of that L1C variant or whatever in the Eastern Corn Belt, which I think that's primarily been a Western Corn Belt phenomena to this point. So it'll be interesting to see if they have as tough of a go with it as we have had, over the past couple of years here in the Western Corn Belt. Then one other thing from the Hogs and Pigs report that struck me a little bit, and I don't know if you guys dive into like the executive briefings that they put out with the Hogs and Pigs report. I always kind of find something interesting in there. And the thing that stood out to me this year is Missouri's been getting a lot of attention. There's a lot of press on how, they're reducing sow numbers down in Missouri. And they did. This is total inventory, not just sows, but they're down 6% year over year. But if you look right above them, you guys are like 9 million pigs. Iowa's like 25 million pigs, so if Missouri's contracting a little bit, it doesn't really matter if the, 25 million pigs or 9 million pigs are expanding at the rate they have been in general. So on to sow slaughter, so I'm aware this is limited data, right? I mean, it says nothing about gilt retention and all that stuff in general. So I think looking at sow slaughter and assuming that we know what's going on out there with the breeding herd is, an incomplete assumption for sure. But if you look, last week's slaughter number was extremely high. For any week of the year, it was one of the highest weekly sow slaughter numbers that we've seen. But, unfortunately, it was following a, lower week impacted by weather the week prior there. So I think year to date, we're only up maybe a couple hundred sows on slaughter relative to the same period last year, which that's not a lot of data or time at this point in time. So kind of watching over the next couple of weeks to see if we, continue to see elevated sow slaughter that would indicate the market is, or the herd is contracting a little bit. And then just to touch on last year, if you look, really from about that May 1st time frame to, maybe October 1st or October 15th, sow slaughter was elevated relative to average or relative to the prior few years. But I think in total, we only killed about 75,000 more sows than we did in 2022 in 2023. So we did reduce the sow herd a little bit, but just not in a super aggressive, contraction as far as sow slaughter goes anyways. And 1 point, so back to that sort of trend increase on pigs per litter of 0.13, you actually need to kill 70,000 sows additional per year, or you need to reduce the breeding herd more accurately by 70,000 sows per year just to tread water on the production side of the equation overall. So, seeing some elevated sow slaughter, but it's not jumping off the charts yet, I would say in general. Then on the wean pig pricing side of the equation, I think pricing and availability has probably changed significantly over the past couple of weeks, but so far this year, most producers that we talk to or clients that we talk to are telling us, hey, there's large groups of healthy wean pigs available out there. I think to an abnormally high degree than what you would see most prior years at this point in time. Typically we're dealing with the impacts of PRRS challenges, which I'm sure you guys follow kind of the SHIC report, University of Minnesota, and maybe the Iowa State one. Both of those look like it's a relatively tame PRRS year so far out there anyways, and I know there's some debate as to whether those are sort of capturing all the PRRS out there, but nonetheless, I mean, it feels like, we're an average year or maybe a little bit, hopefully better than average from a PRRS perspective. But if you look on the left-hand side of the graph there, I think wean pigs started at $32 or somewhere around there at the beginning of the year. So extremely low relative to any other year at that point in time. And if you look at it as sort of a percentage of future 6 months out, it was extremely cheap as well. So yes, we've rallied significantly since then. I think last week's number was right there at, 49.23. But I think that's probably just a result of, maybe the margins increasing and, hey, we were extremely low for the first couple of weeks there. So anxious to see over the next few weeks if that continues, if it's indicative of maybe some additional disease issues or a little bit lighter supply out there potentially. Then I think one thing that really stands out to me too is this is the head count that shows up on that same USDA weekly wean pig report. And if you look, the blue line is significantly different than the prior years. You know, so the number of head of wean pigs that are showing up on that report as negotiated on a weekly basis is, you know, much different than it's been in the past. I had a conversation with a guy that, you know, deals with wean pigs in general, and, you know, at least part of this is maybe better health, so maybe better availability. There's a couple other situations going on too, one of which is pretty logical. I mean, you know, if wean pigs are $39 or whatever they were, and you had a wean pig contract recently sort of come to an end, you're probably not in a big hurry to renew that contract and pay 54% of, or whatever it is, a future 6 months out, rather than just grabbing some wean pigs on the negotiated market temporarily. But nonetheless, I mean, there's a lot of, you know, sort of pig availability out there showing up on the wean pig report here. Then on to export sales. You know, so like I mentioned, most of what I'll review is the monthly export sales. The reason is those are more holistic. The weeklies cover a certain number of commerce codes, and that's it, so they're not all inclusive. You know, but this is the weekly number. So just to point out, the past couple weeks have been really good as far as sales. So, you know, I've touched mostly on supply so far in general, but, you know, it looks to me like, you know, we're starting off decent as far as international demand goes anyways. The last data point there was like 39,220 tons last week. That week and the week prior, both of those, China showed up, you know, so I think they've bought in 23,000 tons or something like that so far in the past couple of weeks, which is great to see. I know there's a lot of conversation out there about, you know, China and, you know, maybe ASF and maybe needing more pork. I think, you know, from my perspective, if you look at prior years, it's not that abnormal to see them buy those couple of weeks of the year, you know, but we'll be watching this closely going forward to kind of see if they're in the market over the next couple of weeks as well. Then on to, you know, so again, this is kind of a review of 2023 as a whole, and you know, I saw some articles that I think like Pork Board put out, or some stats on 2023 just the other day, and I think, you know, from my perspective in the rear view mirror, 2023 was an absolutely phenomenal year as far as exports go. It was not record high as far as either volume or like percentage of production. You know, I think we'd have to go back to 2020 and 2021 where we were record high, but we were pretty darn close. I think we exported 25.09% of our pork production as a whole. And I think a little bit about ex-China exports, just because, you know, they're to some extent not as reliable as Mexico, Japan, South Korea, or Canada. And if you take China out of the equation, so ex-China exports were the best ever. I think we exported 23% of our pork production to, you know, sort of non-Chinese export destinations. So really solid, other than, you know, the ASF years, where the beginning of the year was elevated in both 2020 and 2021. Just a fantastic year as far as exports go. And the driver was largely Mexico. So you guys can see there with the red line at the top, I mean, they pretty much set a record. I think technically February was not record high. We maybe exported one less pig than we did a prior year there. But every other month was record high as far as exports go to Mexico. They took about 38, I think 37 and some percent of our total exports. So just a phenomenal year to Mexico. A lot of clients or colleagues that I've been talking to are headed to Mexico in the next couple of weeks or prior couple of weeks. So just keep in mind, if you're down there and having, you know, whatever, a ham and cheese omelet for breakfast or bacon, I mean, it very well might come from, you know, Minnesota or U.S. pork production. Mexico themselves took about 10% of our total production. So it was just an absolutely great year as far as shipments to them. And then here's China. They've kind of reverted towards normal purchasing patterns, unfortunately, from a historical perspective. I know it shows way below the average line on the red line down there, but that's, you know, dramatically skewed by like late 19 and then early 20 and 2021. You know, so if you pull kind of that ASF time frame out of it, they're basically right on average as far as, you know, exports to China there in general. And then just a couple more points on them. So this is a really messy graph. There'll be a couple of these. It's a ribbon graph, which I kind of used to hate these things. They're growing on me a little bit. But so the total height of the bar is the magnitude of imports of muscle cuts of pork into China on any given month. You know, so this is beginning of the year, this is end of the year. If you look, that's taller than that, right? You know, so as far as monthly imports of muscle cuts, their imports diminished by, I think, 58% from December to January, so down really significant, or sorry, from January to December, so down really significantly over that period. And then probably the point that I wanted to make is not necessarily that, but if you look at this, you know, lime green ribbon, that is the United States. You know, so there's a lot of conversation out there about like, hey, Europe's really expensive as far as pork goes, so if China has ASF, they're gonna come and buy a bunch of pork from the US, and I hope that's the case, but I think history would tell us, you know, kind of regardless of what like the carcass prices are, which, you know, they're not buying carcasses generally at this moment in time anyways, but history would tell us, you know, they prefer, unfortunately, to buy pork from Brazil and Spain, and then everybody else is sort of down somewhere. I think the best we were was, you know, 3rd place, and then the worst we are is, you know, 8th place here recently. So I know, you know, U.S. pork production is the best in the world, safest, best tasting, all that stuff. I just think there's some geopolitical tensions going on there that you're seeing in this graph. And, you know, we'll touch on those when I review the feed side of the equation too, but I think they would kind of confirm that perspective in general. So if they're having disease issues, I hope we pick up some business, but historically they would be buying more aggressively, unfortunately, from, you know, Brazil and Spain than they would from the U.S. Then on the kind of cash and cutout side of the equation, just a quick review of what prices have done, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, but we started out the year, you know, in extremely, you know, depressed cash, negotiated cash prices out there. So outside of the, you know, 5-year range. Yesterday was a nice day on the cash side of the equation. I think we were up just about $3, like $2.98. To just under $70, so $68.19. And if you look at the high end of the range and then kind of convert the high end of the live prices too, we're bumping our heads just below that $70 a hundredweight. You know, so nice movement in the right direction. We are still, you know, well below where we were at this point in time last year from a cash perspective. You know, but I think cash, you know, so not for the individual producers that are negotiating and not for producers that are, you know, priced off of cash, but it's becoming less and less important sort of to the industry as a whole. You know, I'm not saying, you know, cash not being high is a good thing or a bad thing, but, you know, when we think about, you know, the industry as a whole, I really think this cutout number is becoming much more important than what that negotiated cash number is. And, you know, so this is just from math on the Lean Hog Index or from Swine Contract Library, so publicly available information. But if we think back to 5 or 10 years ago, a lot of producers were priced off of negotiated cash, right? You know, so a packer contract might have been, you know, national cash plus or minus X amounts. And then over the past few years, that's trended towards cutout, you know, so a lot of producer contracts are cutout based. If you look at a regression, I think 5 to 8 years ago, 2/3 of the movement in the Lean Hog Index could be explained by movement in cash, holding all else equal. That's the exact opposite now, where as far as the Lean Hog Index goes, about 2/3 of the movement in the Lean Hog Index can be explained by movement and cutout now. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about like futures prices and the Lean Hog Index, cash and cutout. This matters much more, you know, for the industry as a whole on average than the negotiated cash market or price does at this point in time. You know, if you look at cutout, different story, right? On the cash, we started, you know, 5-year lows. On cutout, we're pretty darn elevated at the beginning of the year. Unfortunately, we're basically straight sideways over the past month on the cutout side of the equation, kind of trapped somewhere in that, like 85, mid-80s to upper 80s type range. I think yesterday's value was 87.14 down $1.38. So I guess one thing I'm watching, really, really closely is can cutout get some traction here over the next couple of weeks. On one hand, it's kind of impressive with the amount of production that we've been throwing at the market that it's sideways. On the other hand, I think we all wish cutout was $110 or $120 or whatever. And 7 of the prior 10 years would be basically straight sideways until that May time frame or so, sideways to lower. But 3 years, so 21, 22, and 2014, all started rallying about at this point in time, So I think watching cutout over the next couple of weeks just to kind of see what type of a path it's going to take is important. One of my colleagues, Tim, he likes diving into factoids or nuggets, like he calls it. And, I think he was looking at, and I wouldn't read too much into this, so just huge disclaimer, but looking at other years where Easter is very early, like it is this year. And unfortunately, it seems like we get a little bit of a pop right about there, and then trend sideways to a little bit lower and into the April timeframe. So, again, don't read too much into that, but early Easter seems like it maybe pulls demand forward at the wholesale level, and then, sometimes we have a little bit of a vacuum on the back side of that in general. Let's see, to explain this graph, so the blue line is the 10-year average of the lean hog index where futures settle into, right? The black line there so far is the CME index so far this year. And then all these dashes are where futures settled yesterday. So a lot of times I'll pull this up just to get a little bit of a feel for how pessimistic or optimistic the market is relative to normal or average. And if you look at these first few data points, so this would be Feb that goes off the board today, April and May. They're a little bit elevated relative to average, but not a lot. Then you get beyond that up into June, July, and especially out here in like December, those contracts are really, really elevated relative to historical norms. So I think that's the market kind of telling us like, hey, we're not seeing lower supply yet. But, maybe come this summer, we might start experiencing some of the impact of elevated sow slaughter, mid-year last year in general there. So, and I'm going to be watching closely this June one here. Again, if cutout doesn't start taking off in the next few weeks, it can certainly rally rapidly in the week prior to June expiration or something like that. But if cutout, doesn't start taking off in the next couple of weeks, that feels like a little bit of a big premium to the lean hog index at this point in time if cut out sideways. And then one other point, so that change in exposures to cash and cutout that I mentioned, keep that in mind when you think about how you structure your coverage, right? Because in the past, when we had a lot of cash exposure, cash is usually poor in the winter, right? So that was what was pulling the lean hog index down in the winter. And then also in the summer, typically in the rear view mirror, cash has been very strong most summers. So that's helping with that hump or peak that you see historically there in the summers. So keep in mind, if we have different exposures going forward, you hopefully will see a little bit less of, this tailing off into the end of the year by cash pulling it down. But, unfortunately, it might sort of flatten this out a little bit too. So just, keep that in mind if you're thinking about, coverage or bias in general. Then flipping over to just a brief review on the feed side of the equation. I want to make sure we have time to, discuss strategies and get to any questions. So I was going to be brief here. This is Brazilian corn production going all the way back to, that's 1960 on the left-hand side. And that right-hand bar is the current USDA assumption, not CONAB's assumption as far as Brazilian corn production goes. And I've heard a lot of chatter over the past couple of weeks about how CONAB's at 113, 114 area versus the USDA's at 124. And a lot of people have a really strong opinion on, whether CONAB's right or the USDA is right for some reason. But I don't necessarily think the market or analysts do a good job putting production into context, right? So that horizontal line there is about the level that CONAB's at. So let's say the USDA does cut from 124 down to 114. It's still a huge crop, right? It's like their third biggest crop ever. So Brazil's still doing okay if that's where we end up. And then if you add Argentina to it, that's the current expectation. They've been getting great rain, looking great as far as crop conditions go. So if you add those two together, right now it's a record large South American crop. And even if we drop it to CONAB's number instead of the Brazil's, it's still the second largest corn crop in South American history. So any way you slice it, if you hear some chatter about, oh, hey, USDA is too high, I don't know, they might be, but it still looks to be a pretty good crop in general. And, kind of a couple of points there, why it matters to us. This is Chinese corn imports. And, they became elevated here 3-4 years ago. I'll touch on that on a subsequent slide here. But, and are staying pretty elevated here. Right now, so this is similar to that hog one that I showed, but this is where they're getting corn from. And they've made some changes as far as approving varieties from Brazil for export to China within the last few months. And this is Jan 2021 and December 2023, so about the last 2 years of information on where they get their corn from. And you guys can see right now, why does Brazil matter? Well, historically, if China needed some corn over the past couple of years, we were their main source. You did have Ukraine providing a little bit for them periodically. But if you look over there on the right, so they're still importing corn, but the bulk of it at this point in time is coming from Brazil. And China's made investments in like ports and infrastructure over the past couple of years, so I really think that that's their preference geopolitically to get a little bit of a return. But point being, if South America does not have a good crop, the demand's still there, so that's maybe when we see U.S. exports increase. And then I guess the last thing why I'm sort of puzzled by, hey, is it 124 or 114 is right down here. So this is from the USDA. This is Brazil's second season corn production. And second season accounts for 73% of their total production on average over the past 5 years, or 3 years, I guess that is. And a lot of that's still in the bag right now, right? They're planting some in Mato Grosso, but a lot of it's still in the bag. So there's still a lot of risk on this corn before it gets into the bin, and they have the largest ever crop down there. On the bean side of the equation, similar perspective, I would say, CONAB's below the USDA. They're at, 149.4. I think USDA is at 156 million metric tons. Again, that line is at the, approximately CONAB's level. So if they do cut to where CONAB's at, second largest Brazilian crop ever. And then Argentina, that's not really the case. They had some pretty big crops back, 10, 15 years ago. They've been sort of diversifying into some more corn production, so a little bit less skewed towards bean production. But anyways, that's a pretty good year they've got going on here recently. And if you add Brazilian and Argentine bean estimates together at this point in time, you're looking at the largest crop ever. If you adjust Brazil down to where CONAB's at rather than the U.S., still largest crop ever. So right now, South America is looking pretty darn good. So same kind of story, though, as far as China goes. So that's Chinese bean imports. And then same ribbon graph as far as where do they get things from. So historically, it's pretty cyclical, right? U.S. ships a lot of beans to China around harvest time or just after harvest time. And then South America ships a lot of beans, just after their harvest time in general. But if you check out those blue bars over on the right-hand side there, Brazil is getting a lot of that business still, just after our harvest time frame. So again, I think just kind of that shift in buying preference more towards Brazil than the U.S. And one point on that too, so logistics are a bit of a challenge if you're like Mato Grosso, their largest producing state, sort of landlocked there. I think in the next month or two, Xi Jinping is going to Chile to inaugurate a port on the west coast of Chile. That, you know, they're working on road construction projects through Mato Grosso up through Acre and then kind of down around the Andes Mountains a little bit, but they will be able to export corn and beans out of Chile from northwestern growing areas in Brazil within the next couple of months there if everything goes to plan on that new port. So they can skip the Panama Canal, which right now is low, expensive, long wait times, and you know, generally use ships that are above Panamax capacity then too. So you know, I'll be interested to see how this evolves over the next couple of years there too. And then one other slide on the feed side of the equation, then we'll hop to discussing strategies. Outlook Forum is in the next couple of days here, I think tomorrow and Friday, and that's the first time the USDA will put out a balance sheet for 2024 crop production. And it's going to be huge, you know, so if you look, trendline yield is maybe 183 bushels per acre or something like that right now. So most of the estimates that I'm seeing are having ending stocks this coming year somewhere around 3 billion bushels or thereabouts as far as where we end up. If we get there, that's awesome. You know, that should help keep feed costs down, keep cost of production down maybe for a couple of years. But 2020 was the last time and only time they projected over 3 billion bushel ending stocks initially. So on the May WASDE report, you know, they actually projected 3.318 billion bushel ending stocks. We ended up at 1.236 billion bushel ending stocks. And you know, obviously 2020 COVID, I mean, we have to say, hey, that's probably an outlier. But acres dropped, you know, by about 6.3 million acres. Yield 178.5. Again, they'll probably be 183-ish on tomorrow's or Friday's balance sheet. You know, yield went to 171.4. And then exports, and this was actually driven largely by China. I think they bought around 900 million bushels that year, but exports went from 2.15 up to 2.753 billion bushels. So if we get to 3 billion bushel carryout, awesome, that's going to be very helpful. It's a long ways from having the U.S. crop, which we haven't planted yet, in the bin and having that, that type of carryout. So there still is maybe some risk there for sure. So segue into strategies. Before I do so though, I mean, you know, our opinion would be that your strategy should fit your operation, your business goals, your perspectives. So these aren't strategies that, hey, we think everybody should do by any stretch of the imagination. They're just strategies that look interesting to us. If you're at the point where you say, hey, profitability is strong enough that I want to implement some type of risk management. So first I was going to touch on August strategy. So this is Q3 margins over the past 10 years. So super busy, like multicolored spaghetti there, right? Don't necessarily worry about what year is what, but you know, basically what we're graphing here is if we take a simple economic model of an operation, you know, we can, you know, see where September corn, July corn, and meal prices are, where July, August, and October hogs are at, and then view those each day over the past 10 years to come up with a projected margin that this fictitious producer could have locked in at any point in time over the past 10 years. You know, so just trying to give a little perspective at how good current margin opportunities are relative to history. You know, 2014 is easy to pick out there, right? You know, PED year is head and shoulders above the rest from a profitability perspective. But that horizontal line there at about $10 per hundredweight profitability is the current Q3 projected profitability for this demonstration operation. So you guys can see, I mean, regardless of what year is what, that's a decent level from a historical perspective. You know, so if producers are attracted to that and want to add some coverage, then sort of the next discussion is, okay, you know, how should we structure that coverage to fit the producer's bias? One point is implied volatility is super low. So I think a lot of producers have a bias towards low-cost positions. Those tend to be three-ways in a lot of instances, so buying a put, selling a call above, selling a put below. That is definitely not the position structure I would do with implied volatility below the 5-year minimum at this point in time. So when vol is low, options are cheap, so you're not getting a lot for selling those wings in general. So let's structure a position that takes advantage of implied volatility being relatively low if you want some upside opportunity. So the strategy that I was going to throw at you was, maybe selling some futures. And then if you want some upside flexibility, you could look at buying a call against it. So in this case, the $104 call was about $2 yesterday. And just to flash back, so we're at about 20 implied volatility. Last year was about 24. For that 104 call based on its sensitivity to implied volatility, that's about $1 cheaper. I think 95 cents cheaper than it would have been last year at this point in time. And then if you go back to like kind of a 5-year average, it's about $1. What was it, $1.30? Yeah, $1.38, I think, cheaper than it would be under those different implied volatility scenarios. So paying attention to this stuff, that's a pretty big potential cost savings. And then this is just kind of a scenario analysis. So the market's at about, 96 and some change there. It kind of shows you, hey, if we went down $20 or up $20 in $2 increments between here and there, what would the net price be if we saw that type of a market move, today or tomorrow? And you guys can see, at the bottom end of the range, which we certainly hope we don't experience, but it's a decent price. 94.10 is where the net price would be still on this strategy. Up at the high end, there is losses, right? So I'm not going to say, hey, if we see a $20 rally, you're not going to have any hedge losses. You definitely are if you have this position on. But, over a $20 rally, you'd participate up to about, kind of 107.19 is where your net price would be. And, this could be a little conservative. So I didn't change implied volatility at all. So I would think if we see a rally like that, you'd probably also see implied volatility come up, so that would make that call that you own a little bit more valuable and potentially a little bit better performance at the top end of the range than what this shows. Then visually here, so again, multicolored spaghetti, don't worry about particular years. Again, 2014 is easy to pick out though. But the horizontal red line, the bottom one there, that's the futures level that we'd be selling at. So we'd be protected from everything, below that value. And then in this case, if we're buying that call, we'd participate in everything above that top horizontal line at expiration, So I think 21, 22, and 2014 were above that. So if we're fortunate enough to have a great year like one of those from a price perspective, then great, you get to participate in part of that upside opportunity, but you chop off a lot of this junk that we don't want to have to deal with in general. Same margin graph here, but this is Q4 instead of Q3, and again, 2014 stands out like a sore thumb. One other point is, unfortunately, it's not always sunshine and roses in Q4 from a profitability perspective for hog producers, right? So this is minus $1.61 a hundredweight, so it's still below cost of production. Which certainly we wish it was in the black or above break even by several dollars, but you guys can see it's a decent level relative to kind of that delivery time period over on the right-hand side of the graph there in general. But I think for the most part, a lot of our producers would still want some flexibility here. Nobody really likes the idea of, here, 8, 9, 10 months ahead of time locking in losses at this point in time, even though, they might ultimately be smaller losses than what we've realized, a few of the past 10 years. So the strategy that I was going to throw at you here was, maybe think about, in this case, I used LRP. So yesterday's 12/10 end date, $74 LRP was about $3.81. And then maybe selling an 84 call for about $2. But one point here, though, implied volatility is pretty low here as well. So you could certainly argue that, hey, maybe you just add that LRP or a put, whatever you prefer, and then not sell the call. But I guess from my perspective, a lot of times producers come at us with a cost that they want to spend on a strategy up front. And I think I'll show you in a little bit, but like having a short 84 call in December is, not scary in a lot of years from a historical perspective anyways. And then, I guess while I mentioned LRP, so just a couple of points on this. Since this is so far out in time, you have to own sows to be able to add LRP, that far out in time, right? So this is probably not available to everybody, unfortunately. And then the other thing, so a lot of the times the subsidy for LRP gets attention just because, like, hey, it's $1.25 cheaper than whatever the put would have been. But, I think a great feature of LRP is that, for a similar cost, so this one's a net of $1.81. If producers not using LRP, to get a similar cost, they probably have to do a limited protection strategy, so like maybe $10 of downside protection. So you can have a structure, a position that's the same cost, but unlimited downside protection rather than, a $10 range of protection or something like that. So I think that's a good use for LRP. And unfortunately, this last year, if guys had like tight ranges of coverage, well, hey, we went through those. So LRP really helped that situation by having unlimited downside in a lot of circumstances rather than, just a $8 or $10 wide range. You can see here again, so on a $20 pullback, you're still 71.84, not a great price, but better than 55 bucks, right? So it's got that floor in it, and then allows upside. Again, you do have losses, in this case larger than you would if you had like a long call with the short futures, but it's still like 81.48 net up at some of those loftier values there. And, unfortunately, we don't see 95 a lot at delivery in December. So it does leave you some upside opportunity to hopefully get to profitable levels. But, you guys can see, so in this case, this is still your floor. So we get to chop off a bunch of that, stuff that we've dealt with over the past 10 years. In this case, though, you're not open above this red line. You're open from this red line to the higher one, and then you're capped there. But only 2014 has gone off the board actually above that $84 value. So I think that's why generally I'm comfortable having a short call or a cap kind of up around 84 if it fits the producer's perspective and business game plan. Then last strategy I wanted to review was corn. So again, I think everybody that I talked to is bearish corn. I can't think of an example of a producer that I've talked to recently who is friendly corn, which, seasonality is up and all that stuff. I would still encourage producers, if you're adding hog coverage, the reason that might be attractive at all is because of where corn prices are, right? We don't want to have to deal with $6, $6.50 corn. And again, I get that that's not the current operating assumption, but things can change before this crop gets in the bin. So this is December corn implied volatility. It's not low, but the thing that I wanted to point out is kind of the seasonality to implied volatility. So a lot of times it's positively correlated with price, So if we think about price on December corn, it's typically rallying until that, June, July timeframe when we go through pollination, and if there's no weather issues, then we pull it out. Well, vol does the same thing on average. So maybe like a long vol type position where we own an option with a game plan to review making a change, reducing the cost in that June, July timeframe is probably how I would attack this. So the idea I was going to throw out was maybe just buying an outright 480 call. It's expensive. It's 34 cents, so like worst case scenario, we're 514 net if we hold that all the way till expiration and it goes to zero. But if you look, you're able to participate, to some great values if we see corn go to, $3.50 or $4 or some of those exceptionally low values. But then we don't have to deal with some of the challenges of the past couple of years there if we are unfortunate enough to run into some problems and see a rally. And visually here you can kind of see, okay, if we regress towards, what I hope is normalcy, we can participate down to some of those levels, but we get to, sort of chop off everything above that horizontal line there. And then, just a couple other points on this. So I was looking at, so if we leave implied volatility the same, so don't increase it at all, and hang on to that option till June timeframe, it's about $10, 10 cents a bushel of pure time value decay over that period of time. So yeah, it's 34 cents up front, but it's probably not gonna go to zero. And again, if I was adding this position, I would definitely not just hold it till expiration and see what happens. I would definitely have a game plan to re-review in like that June or July timeframe and see if that's the strategy that we still want or not. I think that's everything I had for you guys. Appreciate you bearing with me, and are there any questions out there? So the question was, have we looked at like margin percentiles in light of, kind of inflation and increased costs? We have producers that look at that in several different ways. So Nick pointed out, up there I showed dollar figures. So that's one way of attacking it, is rather than, margin percentiles, it's just sort of, hey, with my current cost of production, I've got a target at 10 bucks a hundredweight or 12 bucks a hundredweight or whatever that number is. We have gone through the exercise of doing like costs, deflating current costs by like PPI historically, which obviously there's some math involved there. I don't know of a hog producer specific cost of production index that like the Fed publishes or anything like that. So we went with PPI, so we have looked at that. And then I would also say that a lot of our clients or producers who have been working with us for a long time, we actually have 10 years of historical cost information with them, so it's no problem, looking at those margins historically from a, actual cost perspective. And one other point, I've gone through over the past couple of weeks with clients updating their inputs, so their worksheets. Cost of production has come down a lot. I mean, certainly like labor and that stuff is sticky, but I would just, point out, make sure you guys are running over what your current finished product cost of production is too, because it's coming down to some, again, elevated levels from a historical perspective, but certainly more palatable than it was, a year or even 6 months ago overall. So yeah, however the producer wants to handle looking at, margins, whether it's percentiles or dollar figures in light of, the inflation that we've all, unfortunately dealt with. So I think at least part of it was, yeah, I mean, so, when we hear something like that going on, a lot of times a couple of weeks later, so the sow slaughter information is delayed. There is a daily sow slaughter report. I think the weakness there is that it doesn't include packer-owned sows, so I think everybody watches the weekly that captures those packer-owned sows as well. But usually when we hear about, depops happening, that does show up in the data in general. So I think that's probably a significant amount of it. So there's some noise in the data for sure. And then I also think that, again, it's kind of not a holistic view on expansion or contraction just because of the whole gilt retention angle and stuff like that in general. But yeah, it definitely shows up in there for sure. Any other questions, or I'll leave you alone?
So